This is the Moral Science Podcast, and I'm your host, Amber Cazell. In this series, I get to interview experts in my favorite subject, the scientific study of human morality, virtues and vices, evolution of morals, the judgment-action gap, character development, the philosophy of morality, transcendent experiences, researchers' moral biases, cultural values, plus the obligatory trolley dilemma. We are going to talk about it all. Dr. Sarah Schnitker is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Baylor University, where she directs the Science of Virtues lab. She previously researched as an associate professor in the Thrive Center for Human Development at Fuller Theological Seminary. As a principal investigator, Sarah has secured more than $3.5 million in research funding through the John Templeton Foundation for a number of projects with various aims, including understanding gratitude towards God and fleshing out a foundation for the scientific study of patience. In this podcast, we discuss her work, which focuses on the role of religiosity as a fertile context in which virtue and character develop in adolescence. We're going to be discussing a topic that really a lot of Sarah's research kind of centers around or touches upon in one way or another. But a particular paper that I read of hers and that we'll be discussing and kind of working from is called Religion, Spirituality, and Thriving, Transcendent Narrative, Virtue, and Telos. And it's in the Journal of Research on Adolescents, published with Pam King and Benjamin Holtberg in 2019. In this paper, Sarah, you're really making the argument that religion and spirituality is one context in which character and virtue might develop. And I want to take some time to unpack, just as you do in the paper, what is meant by virtue and character and flourishing, and then diving into religion and spirituality. And in this paper, you even have a section, it's called Starting at the End, Telos and Thriving. And I thought that that was great, and I really appreciated it. So could you situate for me what you mean by thriving in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I really do want to acknowledge my collaborators on this paper, Pam King and Ben Holtberg. This really was a group effort. And actually, this paper came out of many years of conversations, coming from kind of different disciplinary backgrounds and figure out what do we really need to understand and what's missing right now. Right. And I think especially Pam King has always argued that if we think about psychology and especially developmental psychology, we need to have a bigger goal than just the absence of mental illness or even just people's personal happiness, that we want to be thinking about what is it to have a thriving person, someone who's really flourishing in life, and really constructing that not at the individual level, but also thinking about groups of people, that it's not just my own happiness or my own well-being, but it's that I'm fitting into this developmental system. The systems can be at many different levels. So a family system, a school, a classroom, broader society. And that if we want to look at someone and say they're thriving, it's that they're actually working to improve their context and improve the lives of other people as well. And I think so often in our studies, we're just looking at what happens and aren't considering what should happen. Now, it's tricky, right? Because as scientists, we aren't trying to make normative judgments about ideal states of the world. And yet I think we have those implicitly as researchers of what we think is the ideal kind of end goal for a human life. And so just trying to articulate what that means, but articulating that it needs to be the person and their context, and that you can't separate the two when you're thinking about how you create a good society and a good person. They're very much together and connected to each other.
Yeah, I really found it insightful. There's a little section in the paper. I'll just read it. I really enjoyed it. It says, we adopt a contextualized approach and define telos as a process that perpetuates a growing goodness of fit between persons and their contexts. Building upon developmental science, we emphasize that human development occurs through reciprocal person-context interactions through which people optimize their chances of actualizing their purposes, resulting in different developmental paths across the lifespan. I have never heard someone conceptualize flourishing as a goodness of fit, and I found that insightful. I found that really insightful. And, I just wonder if you could expand upon that and say more of what you're thinking. When I see goodness of fit, I instantly start to think about statistics, but I actually found that to be sort of helpful.
And I think it's right. Developmental psychologists think about this a little bit better than social and personality psychologists. But I think, right, it's about, do I fit well in this environment? And do I benefit this environment? And I think, sometimes when you look at someone and say you can look at them and say, oh, they're languishing. They're not doing that well. I think so often in Western culture, we want to blame the individual and say, oh, they need to work harder. They need these virtues. Instead of realizing it's also the context that needs intervention, and that it's the whole system that might be broken. And if we want to create virtuous people, we actually need to create virtuous contexts, not just think about the one individual, but how does the whole group work together. And, I can even think about in our scientific pursuits as a lab. It's not that any one member is necessarily virtuous. They are, but it's also that we've created norms and a culture and a context that really helps each person to bring their own strengths and let them shine. And I think that's what we're looking for. And sometimes there's a mismatch, I think, between an individual and her context. Some people find, oh, you know what? My ideals and meaning system don't align with this particular group. I'm going to choose to go elsewhere. And that's a place I can thrive and experience my own well-being, but also contribute to this group. And I think it's hard though, because it makes it very complicated to do research. So that's the challenge, is you can't make, it's a little trickier.
So how do you think about, I'm thinking of researchers like Rick Schwader and this idea that, values seem to vary culture to culture. What do you make of that and character in light of inevitable conflicts in value systems as we sort of move about, especially in increasingly smaller and smaller worlds digitally,
Yeah. It's tough. I do take the perspective that our virtues are contextually bound to a certain extent. As a psychologist reading philosophy, which is always dangerous, right? I really like McIntyre's approach that in his book After Virtue, that talks about what virtues we value and what those mean. It does have this local flavor to it. And I think, when I look at Schwader's work or John Haidt's work on moral foundations theory, I do think there are some universals that tend to emerge, right? We always see care and harm as part of a moral domain. And I think that's from our shared evolutionary history as the species, right? Where we have brains that tend to produce certain types of systems. and certain types of moralities. And so there is diversity, but there also does seem to be a common core across all cultures that we can say, yep, this is pretty much virtuous everywhere. So I think, when we're thinking about virtues, one approach we've taken is, okay, what's the core that we can always look for? And then especially with some of the intervention work I've done with collaborators, we'll actually try to contextualize to a particular context and say, what are the virtues in this context? And before we even start an intervention, to assess what people care about in that context and how that group defines a virtue. So, for example, with Ben Holtberg, when he was at USC, University of Southern California, in their Performance Science Institute, we were developing some interventions for USC student athletes. Started first by asking coaches and athletes, which of these virtues are most important to you? What is virtuous here? And design an intervention around that, rather than assuming we actually knew.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So that's actually one of the things on that Virtue Circumplex project, Sarah. For listeners, I've been working on this project for a while now, trying to understand the relationship between various virtues to one another and relationship between virtues and vices. And anyway, we administered this survey with a bunch of different words that we presumed were virtuous. And, kind of as a testament, I think I'm chalking this up to culture. Maybe listeners will disagree, but one thing that we found is that when people were rating their friends on what we were thinking of as a virtue of being traditional, like almost like respect for tradition, it was statistically behaving like a vice. Like people were scoring it as though it was a vice. And I just thought that was, as I was reading through your paper, Sarah, it kind of made me laugh thinking about what you were saying here, what McIntyre is saying, what Nancy Snow has said about just how culturally contextualized some of these things are. Because I could imagine that maybe in more Eastern cultures, tradition is something that's admired.
Definitely. I think I've been attuned to this issue since I began grad school. So my first year, I started studying the virtue of patience, which you'll know very few people study in positive psychology. I remember when I started, I had 4 references, and one of them was Charles Darwin on the expression of patience. So, and I very quickly realized patience isn't really considered a virtue by a lot of people in the United States in particular.
Interesting.
You're allowed to say, oh, I don't have any of that. To be impatient is seen almost as you're a go-getter, and you don't let anyone keep you down, and you don't suffer. You've beat everything. You've got the best technology, so you don't have to wait. Yeah,
and time bound, right? Like a lot of these things also contextualized to certain generations and times. Like Blaine Fowers is always fond of reminding me that Aristotle did not think humility was a virtue. He always gets a chuckle out of that, but it's kind of true. And I can see that. Like I've been also reading this book called The Quest for a Moral Compass. It's like this global history of morality and like ethical thought. It's actually, shout out to the book. It's actually a great book. I've found it incredibly enlightening to learn about, the history of morality across, globally. It's great. But anyway, same thing. You can see how these different virtues arise out of these different ethical traditions that aren't always shared. They're not always shared. Anyway, okay. Sorry, was there something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I was just going to transition. So I think, this issue is part of the reason we wrote this paper about, should we define virtues a little bit differently than we have in the past? And not to say our idea is brand new. We definitely have people who have resonate with the way we're talking about virtue, but it was finding a way to incorporate that the meaning system matters immensely when defining a virtue is a lot of what motivated us to write this piece.
Yeah, that makes sense.
A way to give psychological language and to think about it within the personality system. In a way, instead of just being like, oh, it's pluralistic, we can't do anything, to say, no, let's actually think about what this looks like inside a person, and how we need to start studying this in a way that allows us to attend to this dimension.
Right. And so I think like one of the things that you really, or at least in the paper, really hit home to me was this idea of why transcendent narrative identity, or just moral identity or life narrative, purpose, why these things are also constitutive of virtue in some way. So let's flesh that out a little bit more. Well, actually, you know what? I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's back up and first talk about what you mean, because we have been using the word virtue a lot now. We've spoken about like, okay, well, thriving or flourishing and this goodness of fit and edification between the self and the context kind of occurs as a result of virtue. But what do we actually mean when we're using that word here?
Yeah, that's a good, tough question. Different psychologists are using it quite differently.
Right.
And I think it's been an issue ever since positive psychology began. Thinking about, well, is virtue just personality traits? Like, what does it mean to have the virtue of patience versus just being really conscientious or agreeable or whatever, right? We've studied these positive human dimensions for a while. And the way we think about virtues, which I think aligns well with philosophy's view, is that these are not actually traits in the way we typically think about personality traits. And instead, they come in at a different level of personality. So for those of you who don't think about personality theory all that often, and just think personality and think big five traits, right? That's, I think, what we most know about. But most theories of personality that are widely adopted today, so McAdams and Powell's, and even Costa and McCrae in their more recent updates of personality, identify at least 3 levels of personality. And each of these levels contains unique information and interacts with the other levels. So the most basic level is these trait-like attributes. So kind of very stable dispositions, what we normally think about and measure when we think about personality. And honestly, a lot of the virtue measures have measured virtues as traits, which I think is problematic. And then the second level is what we call characteristic adaptations, which is very jargony, of course. What I think we're trying to describe there is these are, in some ways, the habits or the schemas or the typical ways we act in the world. So like Cantor, back in 1990, he talked about, traits would be what personality is or what it has. So it's that more basic quality, whereas characteristic adaptations would be what a person does. So it's more about their activity, their engagement with their context. So things like motivations, goals, defense mechanisms, habits, and I put virtues in this category as well, like McAdams. So by being at the level of characteristic adaptations, it's more something that's changeable. It can be something that you develop. It's less biologically bound, or not bound, but less kind of determined by genetic predisposition, and more something that can be cultivated. And so we agree with people like Lapsley and Narvaez and others that if we're going to take seriously the idea of habitus from Aristotle, then we really should be thinking about virtues at this characteristic adaptation level rather than the trait level.
Yeah.
And then the third level, though, I think is the one that really is interesting, which is the narrative identity, or the story of the self that each person tells about their life. And the way we construct our life story, the content of it, the meaning system that really energizes us, that is a whole nother level of information. And I think that's where we are a little bit unique in our theory of virtue in saying, not only is it having particular types of habits that lead to thriving and flourishing of relationships and are moral, but you have to have those habits tied to a story that is bigger than the self. So we use the term transcendent. You could use the term moral, that, it's something that's not self-centered, that it's centered on something bigger. And I know that sounds ambiguous because you have this pluralism of what is moral and but all the moral systems, it's not just about me. So that's something that's consistent about all of them. It's about the group maybe, or about a deity, or about purity, or about caring for other people, but they all are beyond self. And so I think with thinking about virtues, they need to be these adaptive habits, these characteristic adaptations that are used for something beyond the self.
Yeah, that's that is really interesting. So like what is the relationship between like transcendence or beyond the self as particularly related to virtue as opposed to I don't know, like vice even? Like what makes it kind of have this special relationship? I'm curious why this level is necessary for virtue.
Yeah, because I think vices you can have without involving the narrative, right? You can just have bad habits. So let's use the example of patience, a virtue I study a lot. So it's very easy to be impatient. All you have to do is lose your temper or get really frustrated, right? And it doesn't matter what your reasons are for getting frustrated. You're impatient, right? Even if it's for the sake of another person, I still have failed to be patient. Whereas you could have the correct habit. So we could think about an assassin who's killing someone for money, being very patient, showing the good skills of patience, regulating their emotions, staying calm, keeping their breath calm so they can shoot well. But they have the second condition of doing this for some moral reason, to be considered truly patient, that needs to be satisfied. And we wouldn't say they're patient. We would say they're just really good at regulating their emotions.
Yeah. So really interesting. And so let's shift gears now to religion and spirituality as a context for virtue development. So I know that Pam King has spoken about this a lot. Was this originally kind of Pam King's thing?
It was hers, but I've also kind of early in my work, even as a grad student, was looking at religion and spirituality as well with virtue development. So one of my early studies, there's Bob Emmons and Justin Barrett had a grant from the John Templeton Foundation, and I was the grad student research assistant on it. We were looking at how religious conversions and changes in spirituality as a result of going to religious summer camps affected virtue development across time. From teenagers involved, it's an organization called Young Life. So it's evangelical group and just looking about what happens to this, about a third of them every summer report some kind of spiritual transformation, and saying how that changes people, does it, what happens, and kind of fascinating work, difficult work.
I bet. So what did you find in that study?
No, we found that, having the mountaintop experience, so reporting the conversion at camp, didn't affect virtue development as much as continued spiritual growth over time after camp. So, it was interesting that, just having this one-off experience doesn't really change your character, but continue to grow spiritually. That was correlated with those changes in virtue.
And that sort of makes sense to me. I mean,
right.
And plus those like conversion moments are so rare. It just seems like it'd be hard to sustain the momentum of changing.
But for some people, though, I think it really does motivate them to actually engage in personal reflection over time. They're like, is that emotionally salient experience that is kind of the catalyst for the other kinds of spiritual change. I don't think it's that it does nothing. It's more that then you have to have something else alongside of it.
That makes sense. Yeah.
It's really interesting too with that work. Real quick, we also found that we could predict who was going to have a conversion at camp.
Interesting.
Yes, and it actually goes all the way back to William James and Edward Starbuck and their theories of conversion.
Wow.
The adolescents who had a lot of conflict amongst their personal goals were more likely to have a conversion at camp. And the adolescents who had lower meaning on the personal goals they were pursuing, also more likely to have a conversion. What was interesting, though, and actually fits with our kind of characteristic adaptation idea, is that global measures, like personality trait type measures of meaning, were not predictive. So it was more looking at this characteristic adaptation level of personality about personal goals that predicted who would have a conversion.
Wow, that's super cool. So forgive my ignorance. So William James and Starbuck, what was their theory that kind of undergirded?
Yes, sorry. So they said for adolescents, a conversion is a very typical experience that helps with identity development in the U.S. especially, and probably other primarily religious cultural contexts. So when people have a sense of kind of disintegrated self and they don't have a lot of coherence, having religious conversion or a spiritual transformation, it provides this higher order meaning system and goal that then helps to organize the rest of the goal system, and helps them to have a sense of identity and kind of coherence among things that might otherwise seem to be conflicting.
Interesting. So adolescents, did you look into how adolescents who had like conflicting goals, whether their goal contents changed at all, or did they just...
We weren't able to. We really wanted to.
Yeah.
But we found it was very difficult to get adolescents to engage our follow-up survey. We had to make that a lot shorter. And doing the whole goals measure, so first they have to list their goals and then rate them. That was just too taxing for that follow-up.
So what's your hunch? Do you think that...
I think they were shifting, but I think maybe they were shifting a bit. But I think it also was, maybe they were still pursuing the same goals, but were able to reconceptualize them. So for example, you could imagine an adolescent has a goal to like get really good grades in school, and then also has a goal to be a good friend, right? So a teenager, like those aren't necessarily complementary or conflicting, But you can imagine how those could be seen as conflicting for a teenager, right? To be a friend, I need to spend all my time with my friends and go to this party. To get good grades, I need to spend time studying. And so maybe for a teen that's seen as conflicting, but perhaps then like a teenager has a religious conversion and says, I'm supposed to honor God with my work and my relationships. They can see these actually, well, I work hard to honor God. I love people to honor God. So now these are more congruent goals. If the goals themselves had not changed, is what our suspicion is. And based on the other goals research out there, and that you can kind of conceptualize goals at different levels. And it's helpful to have a higher order level to make sense of what feels like a conflict. I know I do that in my own life a lot. I know my academic work, my role as a mentor and researcher, and then my role as a mother, I feel like those two can very easily feel conflicting because time is limited. By having a higher order goal, I can connect them and actually see them as enhancing each other.
Yeah. That's interesting. And it makes intuitive sense to me. Okay. So let's turn back now to religion and spirituality, like the mechanism. So that's one mechanism, right? By providing these second order, narrative identities, I suppose. That's fascinating to me. And I'm wondering if you've done other research looking at how religion and spirituality might provide narrative identity or purpose in some way.
Yeah.
And then sort of related that to virtue.
Yeah. So I think, and first to speak a bit more conceptually, I think religion in particular, so by that I mean, you can talk about individual spirituality, but a religion or a spirituality that is cohesive and that actually involves other people and some traditional practices of some sort. It's kind of a wild context because it has this meaning system that's talked about at least on a weekly basis. And then it also provides these particular habits in the form of spiritual practices like prayer or giving or volunteer service, and you do these practices with the people who you're also talking to about this meaning system. And so it kind of has the 1-2 punch for virtues in that it gives you actual activities to do that help you build the habits. And actually explicitly will sometimes connect those to the meaning system. And there's not a ton of contexts that do that. There's a lot of great contexts that help build habits. There's meaning systems you can get, but to have the two together is really useful. And so one study that we did that gets at this to a certain extent, it's hard, right? Because these are very complex types of things to measure. But one really fun study we did was looking at adolescents who were training for half or full marathons.
Oh, wow.
With an organization called Team World Vision. So, I'm often in my career committed to doing research in naturalistic settings that have a lot of real world generalizability, and then also trying to do similar things in the lab. So this was one of those real world type studies. And so what we did is we measured the adolescents at 4 time points across their training experience and then after their race. And it's a really interesting group because they meet each week in teams. It does have explicit religious connections, the training group. So it's a Christian organization. And they explicitly connect running the marathon and all of the training activities to a pro-social purpose of providing clean water and safe water to young people in Africa and countries. So they do that. It's kind of this ideal virtue development context because they're helping build habits through actual running, and that takes self-control and patience, and they're doing fundraising at the same time. And then they're actually giving this narrative to the young person about why you're doing this. One study we had that I think got published this year in Journal of Personality, we assessed the motivations for running at each of the time points. So we asked them, why are you doing this? So are you doing this because you want to get physically fit and kind of for your own health? Are you doing this to help kind of other people for the benefits that are going to be for folks who need clean water? Are you doing this to grow closer to God or to build your spirituality? And what we found is that to the extent that they had more transcendent motives, so the pro-social or the spiritual motivations, they were also more likely to be growing in the virtues of self-control, patience, and generosity. And I'm trying to remember exactly. And then change in generosity, you only see that increasing when people had that pro-social motivation also increasing. So we found self-control actually increased pretty well, even if you just had a health and fitness motivation increasing. Whereas for those more virtuous virtues that really depend on beyond the self motivation, like patience and generosity, those beyond the self motivations were what were predictive.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what other contexts can kind of pack that 1-2 punch, as you're saying, that religion and spirituality seem to be packing. I think you mentioned, and it struck me as a good example, like politics and political affiliation seems to be big in this way.
Yep. I think politics, and the one that I think actually comes sometimes the closest is environmental movements. Because I think politics sometimes is hard because it doesn't always get to the really ultimate concerns of those deep existential questions of life. I mean, it gets there, but not as far. But I feel like some of the movements for environmentalism, it's about saving the world for millennia ahead of us. And it has this bigger scope of time and very specific practices that people adopt and habits that I think are closer to approximating what we see here. I think sometimes, and I talked about this running model. Like, I think sports is an interesting example as well. Again, when you get on a sports team, there's practices, there's narrative the team develops. Sports are interesting because those narratives vary quite widely. And sometimes it leads to some of the worst behavior, as we've seen. So I think it's when you get these intensive communities and then the type of narrative that's emerging, that's when you see real action. But religion is unique in that it really deals with big questions very regularly of life and death, which maybe soldiers in a war units, but you often find in military units people bring religion in. So it's an interesting question.
It is. And I was thinking about military as well, and thinking about often it seems that people draw a lot of, I'm not sure what the right word is. I don't want to say flow, and I don't know that I want to say purpose, but like, it also seems there's a way that bodily movement comes into play in a lot of these things. Like, I'm thinking of, like worship services for religion and spirituality, and like, adolescents and adults, like talking about getting goosebumps or just like being so overcome by the Spirit and things like that.
Yes.
Or like dance and sports, same kind of thing of like a bodily movement. Are you aware of any kind of research on this sort of a thing?
Yeah, Patty Van Capellen at Duke actually is doing quite a bit of research right now, the John Templeton grant, on kind of embodied spirituality and how worship and worship postures and prayer postures and all these different things affect people's experiences, their religious experiences, the self-transcendent emotions they experience, and how those might differ depending on the type of worship they engage in, right? It's really fascinating stuff. So like if someone kneels for prayer versus stands up with their arms open, like how does that affect their view of God and what types of emotions they experience? And there's also quite a bit of work out there too on group, like rhythmic group singing and dance. And I think, right, and what religion does is it not only gives that experience, but it explicitly connects it to this meaning system, right? So I think a lot of us, well, maybe not a lot of us, but some of us, and me when I was younger especially, right, we go to awesome fitness classes at the gym where we have this experience of doing the workout with other people and feel that bonding, but it's not connected to something really deep or meaningful. And that's where religion has this leg up, I think, on a lot of other institutions, is that it says, and this is part of this big picture thing. And I think, I don't think we have to have, not everyone needs to be part of a traditional religion to get these experiences. But I think it's very important, if we care about moral development in a pluralistic society, to study what's worked so well and what's worked so poorly, as we think about designing interventions to help people build good character, because many people are disaffiliating from religion. And so what's being lost, and we don't necessarily have to give these activities through religion, but if we're going to say, thinking about like a secular public school program to build character strengths, completely ignoring religion or ignoring the meaning systems of youth, even if they're diverse, it's not going to be very effective, is my guess. So trying to say, okay, maybe we're not doing this in the context of religion, but what do we need? What are some essential elements that have traditionally been in those contexts, and how can we do that even if it's a more secularized version?
Right. And I'm curious too, if you've thought about more mechanisms that, really might make religion and spirituality a good context for virtue development, or ways that, or even aspects that religion and spirituality do not contribute to with respect to developing virtue.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, so when it does, like that moderation question, sometimes depends on the variety of religion. One of the downfalls, I'd say, of religion spirituality tends to be that it's really good at forming group cohesion, but it can very much exclude people unless it's intentional about watching out for that. And so I think that's something religious groups need to watch out for is, okay, we're great at creating cohesion amongst our group, but does that come at the cost of derogating those outside of our group? And I'm not going to be able to think of the reference right now, but I know that there have been studies that have shown you can help prevent that effect, but it has to be framed within the context of the meaning system of that religion. So I know I'm thinking of a terror management study, right? Because we know with terror management theory, death crimes typically lead people to uphold their in-group and start degrading out-groups. And they found that with Christian participants, when they tried to kind of give a little sayings and say, oh, don't do this, you want to be kind to those who are different. If those were framed in a secular manner, they did nothing. But if they used Bible verses and phrases from Christianity to talk about attending to and taking care of people outside their group, was actually quite effective at buffering against the out-group derogation that comes with priming death. So I think there's ways that this can be done if a religious group actually cares enough to try.
Right. Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, like in the paper, you spoke a lot about, religion and spirituality providing rituals and practices for characteristic adaptations that develop things like self-control. You also spoke about transcendent narrative identity, like you're saying, like connecting this to these deeper questions and these broader issues. Like one key aspect of virtue that I didn't feel you directly spoke to was like how religion and spirituality do with respect to cultivating appropriate motivation as like a key aspect of virtue. And I wonder, have you thought about that? Have you thought about religion and spirituality's the ways it does or does not appeal to motivation? Like I'm thinking about, I guess, like legalism and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's it does matter, right? There's, I think, a lot of motivations that can be present that people pick up from their religious context, right? And this, I think, psycho-religion in its very early stages with the focus on intrinsic versus extrinsic religiosity that Alport even started looking at, really shows that this has been a primary concern for researchers since the beginning, that there are lots of reasons people engage in religion, and that then affects their moral behaviors as a result, their prejudice, their pro-sociality. So it's tough because, right, there's this bidirectional relationship between the person and their religious context. So, and I think you can see influence. So certain religious groups are talking about religion in different ways, right? So some, even if you look just within Christianity or even just within evangelical Christianity in the US, you see such diversity. Sometimes it's presented very much as self-help as a way to make your life better. Other times it's much more presented as something you engage to please God or to do something for others, right? As you're saying, sometimes it's more legalistic, that this is a fear-based thing of avoiding punishments versus approaching something that's good.
Right.
So I think it's really tough right now. But I think, one strategy for researching this that I'm excited about is one my grad student Juliet Ratchford is working on, which is to use more of these goal-based measures to assess virtue. And you could specifically, so like we could ask people, what are the goals you're working on right now? And we can say, okay, how patient are you as you work on this goal? How much frustration are you experiencing? Opposite. But we can also ask people, what are your motives? Why are you pursuing this goal? Are you doing this because you think you have to, because God's going to punish you if you don't? We could ask, are you doing this because you're so grateful for everything you've received in this life? So I think by moving beyond trait measures, we're going to be able to start to actually assess these motivations and be able to say something about how religion motivates a bit more than we know right now.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm trying to conceptualize, like for me, what's interesting, I have Protestant Christian backgrounds growing up, and like the doctrine of grace is theologically interesting to consider with respect to like these motivational components to virtue development. I guess I'm just thinking out loud here, but you know, this idea of grace as sort of this mechanism of getting rid of motivations that are fear-based or are, you know, extrinsically motivated, like I'm behaving well in this life so I get rewards in the next life, or that sort of a thing. It's theologically interesting to consider this motivational layer in the context of virtue requiring good motivation.
And I think, and what gets really tricky too for doing studies on these is because someone might have a theological belief in grace they maintain, but do they really carry that through in their day-to-day lives? Right. Like a belief in grace is really counterintuitive to our natural understanding as a species, right? You should not get what you don't deserve, right? We're taught over and over, you get what you deserve, there's reciprocity. All of our interactions tend to teach us if you're really bad, you don't just get all these amazing things.
Right, and consequences.
Right. And I think it depends. Like, it's easier for some people who have kind of unconditional positive regard from their parents. It might be easier for them to believe in this kind of grace idea, and actually not just tout it as a belief, but actually kind of more implicitly believe it. But I think for a lot of people, it just doesn't make any sense at an implicit level. And it's hard too, because it goes against belief in a just world for a lot of people, right? Well, that's not fair. So I think that's one of the challenges I've faced when doing psycho-religion research, and is, okay, this is what the person says they believe, but what do they do really get a little bit deeper what's really going on? And
yeah.
I think, Carissa Sharp has done a bit of work on this, and who else was on that paper? Bonnie Zoll, maybe, and Nick Gibson. They did some work on kind of these like head beliefs and heart beliefs with religion. Because certain religious concepts are just hard for people because they're so counterintuitive to the natural world.
Interesting. So is that kind of like explicit versus implicit?
Yeah, I think that would be, a good way to think about it.
Interesting. Okay, well, so in just our last minutes of closing, what else are you kind of working on in this line of work? You mentioned that work with Juliet on the goals-based measures. What else are you doing?
Yeah, we're also, right this semester, we're getting ready to do a study that explicitly manipulates motivation, or experimentally, probably be the better term, for engaging in virtue development activities. So we're going to have everyone practice meditation, but we're going to tell some participants that they're doing this to help them connect with something bigger than themselves, to grow spiritually, to really and morally, and really provide more of those transcendent motivations and keep that primed as they engage the activity. Whereas the other group, we're going to have them do this meditation. And we know from tons of studies, meditation helps develop good things. We're going to tell them, you're doing this so you can improve your academic performance, so you can improve your focus and attention and do better on all of your activities in life. Which is not a bad thing, but it doesn't have that transcendent framing. So we want to see us manipulating this and providing kind of that motivation that's more transcendent changes the effectiveness of a meditation activity. We're going to be giving money as well and seeing if people who are in the transcendent condition actually donate more of their money at the end of the study.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. And who's that in collaboration with?
Yeah, so I was just going to say, so that is in collaboration with one of my students, Emily Williams, and then Juliet Ratchford's also going to be a part of that study. And then we actually have a philosopher, Tim Paul, who's part of the team for that study. And as a philosopher, he's really interested in this motivation component of virtue. And
awesome.
Is that psychologists have not really attended to this very much. So it's a pretty fun group.
Yeah, very cool. All right. Well, Sarah, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. And it was really fun to get to learn about this. This is actually the first time we've really spoken about religion and spirituality kind of explicitly in the podcast as a topic. So thank you for introducing us to it.
Yes, thank you. It's been fun to chat.
Thanks for listening. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, or requests, contact me at www.moralsciencepodcast.com. The Moral Science Podcast is sponsored by listeners like you. If you enjoy the series, please consider leaving a tip at www.patreon.com/moralscience. Music throughout the program is My Kruby by Kindswider and can be found at www.freemusicarchive.org.